All right, so I'm going to go back through and just maybe cover maybe one or two things that we didn't cover real good on the Sodom part. And then I've got a couple other things that we'll do, but I just want to wrap up this side. I think we covered most of it. I just want to clarify one or two things. So when I was talking about Abraham and his 318 trained men, I don't know, did I give you the word Apiru? That's a name that we find quite a bit in Egyptian and Canaanite texts. That was a word for like wandering kind of nomad groups, very similar to what Abraham would have been, a wandering kind of self-sustained group there. And they called them the Apiru. Some people think, and it's kind of hard to prove it, but a lot of people think that this is a Canaanite or Egyptian way of saying Hebrew, for these groups, right? So this is perhaps an ancient, pre-Exodus references to the early Hebrew groups, because Eber was, up the line from Abraham, so that's probably where the name Hebrew came from. And so it would have predated Abraham then, so you would expect that there might be some examples of it there. And so there are lots of references to the Apiru, and so a lot of people think that that is a way of saying Hebrew in their language. And they were groups that were shepherds, wandering groups, but they were often known for having very effective military groups there. And so that's the concept of the Apiru is what we think is the general thing that Abraham was doing, that these Apiru groups had a trained military, and they were shepherds, kind of wandering nomads, and when they showed up to a group, they were known to offer their services of protection because they had a trained military. And so that's what the Apiru were known for, was offering their services of a trained military. So it seems like that is why Abraham was connected with Melchizedek, is that when he comes to that area, he's probably offering his services of these 318 men to the local group. So that's one thing. And then the comparison that I would also draw, and I think I might have touched on this last week, was that this is probably the model that David was taking as well. A traveling shepherd with a trained military going from region to region, and when they showed up at the region, offering protection in exchange for some goods, right? So that while they were there, they were looking to protect whoever they were near in exchange for some kind of payment, right? So that seems like what Abraham is doing. It would explain why the king of Sodom thought Abraham would expect payment, right? When Abraham protected him, right? Abraham comes in and protects him, and he says, "No, I'm not going to take any of your money." But he does then give money to the king of Salem there. So it seems that they had some kind of a contract there. And then also along these same lines of Abraham kind of protecting everyone, I think it's kind of interesting that you don't see Lot, because we know that when the angels showed up to Sodom, they found Lot sitting at the gate, right? Which means he was judging. Most likely means that he was judging. Like if you sat in the gate, that's where people. So if you've got this town, and then obviously that's Sodom, and then you've got this gate with the two big towers with this small entryway into town. These rooms here would often be places where judges would sit and hear cases and things, because only a few people lived in town. Most other people were out in the suburbs. And so when they would come to town, they would come to the gate expecting to be heard. And so they didn't have a whole lot of business in the town. And so they would often put things that the outside people would need to do, they'd put them up here, so they just come here, have it, and then leave. So anyway, so they find Lot here in the gate, which probably meant he was a judge. And then we notice then that when the men surround Lot's house, they make the reference that you started off as a sojourner and now you're judging us. We're going to punish you even more than the angels that are in your house. So clearly they were upset, kind of jealous, if you will, of the fact that Lot had become a judge. So that's why those two references make us think that Lot had become a judge in Sodom. So one of the reasons that I think that's interesting is that when Lot is taken, it's kind of like he's taken out in the fields, sort of, because they didn't ransack the town. Later, Lot has a home here because they come in and they surround his home. So later, Lot is now living inside Sodom, judging in the town, whereas earlier he was living more in the fields with the flocks. They talk about his tent, that he was taken. And so anyways, I think an interesting thought then is, does Abraham's victory, right, and obviously the king of Sodom would have been impressed and grateful, does Abraham's victory restoring everything that Sodom had lost, is that the key as to why Lot was promoted to judge in the town? It's circumstantial evidence, but I do think it's interesting that prior to this battle, Lot is not a judge. After Abraham comes in and wins and restores everything back to Sodom and they get all their money back, then all of a sudden you see Lot is a judge. And so it almost makes it seem like this was a thank you gesture. In fact, even the people that surrounded Lot's home said, you started off, you were just a sojourner, and now you want to judge. You're a judge. And they were jealous of him. So it almost seems, clearly the king must have promoted him. He wouldn't become a judge without the king's approval. And it happens right after Abraham's victory, because there's not a whole long period after this victory where Abraham rescues Lot before the Lord judges this area. It would have been a short period of time. So it's basically immediately after then, now Lot has a freestanding home. He's a judge. So these were probably gifts from the king of Sodom to Lot because he's grateful for what Abraham did. So Abraham says, I'm not going to take anything from your hand. Maybe Lot didn't have that same level of because we could clearly tell that Lot wanted the good life because he chose Sodom to begin with because it had the material pleasures.
He chose the better land.
Yeah, he chose the better land. That's what I mean. So he chose the better spot to begin with. So that kind of shows you his mindset. And then, so it kind of seems he probably said, well, hey, if Abraham doesn't want all that stuff, I wouldn't mind a position, And who knows, maybe the king of Sodom's thinking, hey, if I got this guy as my judge, then by default, I have Abraham's military service as well, So there's probably mutual benefit from both of these guys, And then you see about having a son-in-law now in this spot. So I don't know when that happened. Maybe that could be connected with some of that too. That his daughters marry into the town. And so a lot of times there's a financial transaction with that too. But anyway, it's just kind of interesting to see Lot's change of location there immediately after the battle. Okay. All right. See if there's anything else we didn't cover with Sodom. Nimrin, just for your notes, is the name of what we think is Gomorrah. That's the name of the excavation site. So Hammam is Sodom. The excavation site called Nimrin is Gomorrah.
Gomorrah located in that plain close to Sodom?
Yeah, so Hammam is 8 miles from Nimrin. So they're fairly close. close enough that they could have been the two major spots in their zone, because you couldn't put two major cities right next to each other. So what they think is that they listed 4 cities, and that 2 of them would have been major cities, the other 2 kind of just satellite cities, subservient to the 2 major ones, right? So Admam and Zeboim were the other 2, and those were probably smaller cities that kind of emerged out of Sodom and Gomorrah. Another thing that I think is interesting, right? So clearly this is Egypt. No, just kidding. It's Israel. And so it's interesting to read when Abraham, or when Moses rather, is standing on Mount Nebo here, looking over. It says he's able to see from the plains of Jericho, which would be this side of the Kekar, right? Because Jericho's here, and so the where it hits the Dead Sea, it spills over on either side, and it becomes a very fertile area here. And so he says he could see from the plains of Jericho over to Zor, which was the 5th city there that was the one that was spared, that Lot was going to run to. So it's just kind of interesting that we're almost certainly in the right spot if you can say that from this spot, Moses is seeing everything that Abraham and Lot were seeing when they were on the other side. So it's another confirmation that we're in the right spot, that when Moses is here, he's able to see all of these areas from here, which is further confirmation that the areas are not down here this way. It's saying he could see it from Jericho to here when he's looking from this spot, looking over in, right? So that's kind of interesting. And then, and I might have talked about this a little bit when we first went over it, but here in Bethel and Ai, up north here, when Abraham and Lot are looking down, it's just kind of a neat thing that he says, look, if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. And he gives them the option. But then after they leave, after Lot leaves and they separate, Abraham then in that same spot has an encounter with the Lord, and the Lord says, I want you to look to the north, south, east, and west. All of this land I'm going to give to your descendants, right? And that's when he has him walk through the land and some of that kind of stuff. But so after, I think it's just interesting that sometimes we lose the point of that, because it kind of seems like 2 separate stories. But God says, look to the north, south, east, and west. Everything that you see, I'm going to give to your descendants. I think the interesting part is because he had just made an agreement with Lot that if Lot took this side, and so Lot, in Abraham's mind, that's his side, and this is Abraham's side now. But I think it's interesting that God says, no, look to the east, the north, south, and west. All of this land I'm going to give to your descendants, as if to say, I know you just made a pact that Lot could have that part, but in reality, that's not Lot's either. That's going to be your descendants also. And so even though Abraham tried to do the right thing and said, hey, listen, I'll give you all of that land because I want you to be blessed. So Abraham comes at it with a good attitude. God steps in and says, actually, I'm going to give your descendants the whole thing. And so it's not going to be that this is your side and that's Lot's side. I'm giving your descendants that part too. And he did. So this part here was the Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh took that spot that was originally Lot's. So Lot's people ended up down here in Moab. I guess more up here. But in Moab was where Lot's people ended up. But it's just kind of interesting. We also think, okay, did Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh mess up by not wanting to enter into the promised land? And they took this part over here. But God kind of foreshadowed that it was going to be his will, so that from where Abraham was, everything that he saw was going to be part of his children's inheritance. So it was almost as if Reuben Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh had no choice, that God had already promised that area to Abraham, and so it almost looks like they're just wanting to do it out of selfish reasons, but God used that to fulfill something he had said to Abraham much earlier, that from this spot I want you to look in either direction that you can see, all of that is going to be your descendants. And so if those three tribes had come over, then they wouldn't have had that like God said they were going to have. And so God said, even that part that Lot took is going to be yours. Now, and it happens right after. It's like the very next couple of paragraphs is when God has that thing. Right after they split, God comes in and says, no, I want you to look in every direction, and that's what I'm going to give your children, as if to say, what you thought is going to be all Lot's is not really going to be all Lot's. I'm giving you all of it anyway. I know you think you split it in half, but really I'm giving you all of it. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting.
So the half tribe of Manasseh, is that half of Manasseh's tribe, or is that just because Ephraim and Manasseh were...
Manasseh was on both sides.
Manasseh was on both
Yeah,
sides?
their territory was
the children of Joseph, right?
Yeah, so Manasseh, so this would be, I believe this is the way they had it broken up. Manasseh up here, Gad, and Reuben. And then, yeah, so Manasseh then, so you have here is Judah, a little bit of Benjamin, and then most of this was all Ephraim. And then, so originally it didn't work out that way, but God's original lines were just straight across. Because he would often give a list and say all the way over to the sea, which means the Mediterranean Sea. So God's original thing was that it was just like, yeah, it was just like this. Yeah, it was kind of straight across, so that everyone had access to the river, everyone had access to the ocean for the most part, right? Now, yeah, and so they, yeah, so now it got all kind of wrecked up, but this was God's original kind of look, and so Manasseh then was up here and on this side, so they were on both sides, which is why sometimes you hear kind of some of these battles in the north, like Deborah and some of these other battles, they fled to Manasseh in some of these areas. That's what it's talking about, because those battles were taken up here at the Sea of Galilee, but Manasseh was over there in this area. And so, and this is the region through here that became known as Gilead, right? And so that's this area. So half of Manasseh stayed here, the other half went here. And so, yeah, so Manasseh was one of the biggest tribes to begin with, even though Ephraim was one of the most influential. And Ephraim had the eventual full blessing of Jacob. When you go to Genesis 49 and Jacob's giving out all of the blessings, Ephraim gets the double portion over Manasseh. But in reality, in the first generations, Manasseh was a much bigger tribe. So the thing for Ephraim is probably more of a spiritual blessing down the road, because they were not the largest tribe, although they were very influential. Joshua was from Ephraim, and Deborah was from Ephraim, and so they had some of the earliest leaders were from Ephraim, but they were not the largest tribe.
But the Lot family was the Moabites and the Ammonites.
Yeah, so he had two, and so they were right next to each other. So Edom is down here. That's Esau's children. And then Midian is down even further. So this is the general group. And so, who else? Yeah, so Moses comes in this way. They try and pass through Edom, which is in this area, which is Petra. Remember we talked about that Petra, that dry region there is Edom. They wouldn't let them really go through the good part of Edom. So they'd go kind of through the desert part. Then they get up to this area, and Moab is there, and Moab challenges them. And so the Israelites defeat Moab here and take all their land. And then they kind of go up this way. Og and Sihon, were the areas that they defeated to take this land, right? And so all that was left to these other groups was kind of the outskirt part. They also originally owned this part up to the Jordan, but when Moses came through and defeated that part, it pushed these regions back to here, and they maintained this outskirt part. They did not maintain this, and Israel kind of held on to that. And so there were always border skirmishes, and then you think of Syria, and these areas were constantly pushing down on them from this side. So they were always, you get the Philistines landed here, the Egyptians were here, right? That goes back to the whole Ezekiel's wheel within a wheel, that all the way around were enemy nations, always. And so, it's kind of interesting how the inheritance kind of worked out as a reflection of what Abraham was saying, what God told Abraham from the very beginning. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I think that's about it for the Sodom part. I think there was too much more. I think we talked about how we saw kind of after the flood time, you start seeing much more militarized cities. Probably goes back to what the Bible was saying about Nimrod and how he began to kind of do some of the fighting and attacking of other people. And so I think that's why you start seeing cities like Sodom, Jericho become defensive cities. And it's just kind of interesting how that worked, that the pre-Bronze Age cities were not necessarily like that. That they, even I think some of the Egyptian cities, I think, predated the flood. That first pyramid that was so big, and the Sphinx, I think those things predated the flood. And it's kind of interesting. In those, you don't necessarily see the big walled cities there. It's something that you see later. Perhaps that's a reflection of how the pre-flood was. They might have been evil, but perhaps not with armies attacking other cities as much. I don't know. But definitely some of those pre-flood cities, you don't see the giant walls. You see giant architecture. I think the pyramid is massive, but you don't necessarily see giant walls around those earliest cities. So it might be a reflection. The Bible says that they were evil. Doesn't necessarily explain what kind of evil, right? So it might not have been just purely militaristic. Could have been other forms. It could have been heart evil, lust or greed, those types of things. But we don't see as much of these ancient cities with the wall structure. We begin to see that closer to the time of Babel and Nimrod, where the Bible says that Nimrod became a mighty hunter. The implication of that word is a hunter of men, and meaning putting people into slavery. Because you begin to hear about slavery and stuff. You don't really hear about that pre-flood, the concept of slavery. But then after the flood, you do.
I thought that when they were hunters, I thought that they were eating people.
Right. Yeah. So it's like slavery, and I think militaristic. So it's not for sure that pre-flood people divided up into military groups to attack each other as much. It takes one group to decide, hey, we're going to be a military, before everybody else says, hey, we got to do that too. Then so it's possible that when it's saying that during Nimrod's time, and then the Bible talks about during Peleg's time, the earth being divided during the time of Peleg. So maybe that's it's either a reference to the earth, some kind of major earthquake or something like that, because it says the earth was divided, or some type of major battle, right? And so somewhere along the way, we start getting cities operating out of fear of other people's militaries, right? So when there is no other military, you may have some really great building project out of pride and vanity, but not necessarily the wall because of fear, right? And so...
Well, plus the things that the languages and they can communicate
Yeah.
Probably before the flood, they were maybe communicating in the same language as been a lot of.
Yeah, so perhaps the division at Babel creates multiple cultures, and you say, well, it's us versus them. You're not one of us mindset, perhaps after the Tower of Babel. And so it's kind of interesting that you don't see much about that slavery concept before, but you do begin to start seeing it around the time of Abraham, which would be, a couple hundred years after the flood. Right?
Most wars seem to take place between people who have different languages for the most part, because they have misunderstandings and don't understand.
Yeah, even today, you see most of our, we consider, even though we're all people, we tend to consider, for whatever reason, even though I don't have anything much more related to me about somebody across town versus somebody in Canada, we tend to see those people because of an artificial line that somebody drew on a map and what they decide to call themselves. We feel that they're totally different people. Even though I don't have anything more in common with Joe Schmo down the road than I do with some guy in Canada, I tend to view them differently because of our artificial divisions. And so it's possible that Tower of Babel was a precursor to a lot of the defensiveness that we see. It's described as a tower. It doesn't say anything about having a giant wall at Babel. Could have, but it doesn't say that. Whereas at Jericho, it specifically mentions the wall. Sodom talks about that. But Babel, it just talks about it being a tower. And they were unified. There was no fear. Everybody was working together. In fact, that was part of it. The Lord said, look what they're going to accomplish because they're all united, And so after that, there is the implication that when they're not united, they will not be as effective and almost undercut each other, which is what the wars were doing. Keeps the building projects of vanity, I think, is kind of what the Lord was after here. That it was a false religious vanity kind of thing that they had given themselves to, and so the Lord is saying, we got to kind of put a stop to that. So anyway, it's kind of interesting that is we can tell from the Bible story of Babel that things changed after that, but it's kind of neat to go back in and look at the archaeological record and see they actually literally built their cities differently, like you would expect, that once everyone was different, you start seeing battles more, you start seeing fighting, you start seeing cities built with a mind to keep the other people out. So, okay. Let me see here. Okay, I think that's all we'll do for the Sodom part. So, one other thing then. And this I just kind of saw today. It's kind of along different lines, but so in terms of research, one thing that a person could do if they're wanting advanced studies of the Old Testament would be to look for museums that have artifacts, right? And to maybe kind of research and visit some museums that might have large collections of things from antiquity, because not everything that has been discovered at a particular site stays at that site. I mean, once they find it, a lot of people want to have that stuff, so they end up in museums and things like that. So you could travel to a biblical location and see the spot, but most of the things that are found there, they can't just leave it out there in the open. Unless it's some giant building like in Egypt, some of those buildings you can't move. But any of the artifacts found in these cities from the times of the Bible are then shipped to museums, right? So if you want to begin to have some advanced research and have more familiarity with these things, perhaps there might be some museums that you could look at. So the reason that I found this is kind of an interesting story. I just today happened to have a thought. I wanted to look up and see what books were out there on the 12th dynasty of Egypt. Because almost nobody in scholarly, I can't say almost nobody, but most people in scholarly research they don't associate this with the Exodus and the biblical stories. But this is the dynasty that I believe goes from just prior to Joseph all the way down to the drowning in the Red Sea. And that was the bookends, that the Pharaoh who started the 12th dynasty was in Joseph's position in the 11th dynasty. He was vizier, number 2 over the entire kingdom in the 11th dynasty, and he killed the Pharaoh that he was working for and started his own dynasty, the 12th. Then apparently his vizier tried to do the same thing to him, but he survived. And then that's when they weren't sure who it was. Someone, according to the record, let a group of warriors into the Pharaoh's sleep chambers, right? And they weren't sure who on the inside let them in. It was either the butler or the baker, right? One of them opened the door and let these people in. And so there was a big battle that went on. The guard that was loyal to the Pharaoh defended him. He fought too, but he was badly wounded. So he sent for his son to come, who was out in the field, so to speak, with the military, right, defending the farther regions. Said, hey, I might die, and if you're not back here for me to pronounce you Pharaoh, and I die, somebody else is going to take over the throne, and they're going to kill you. So you need to hurry up and get back here with the military. And so he rushes back. His dad doesn't die, and so they have a co-regency for several years. But his dad, in the letter, which we have, his dad tells him, don't put anyone in the vizier position. Because his dad was the vizier and killed his Pharaoh and took over. And then his vizier tries to have him killed. And so he's telling his son, don't put anyone in that position, which is why the position was vacant for 3 years prior to Joseph interpreting his dream. And then he says, here's obviously an honest man who's got the Spirit of the Lord. What better? I need somebody in that position. I don't trust anybody. If he's got the Spirit of the Lord in him and he's looking out for my good, then he's the perfect one for this spot. And so Joseph fills that position. So that was the beginning of the dynasty, and then the end was obviously Pharaoh drowning in the Red Sea. And his wife took over and had a very short reign. And then the
13th dynasty, the one where there was concurrence?
The 13th dynasty then was the general from the 12th dynasty that was manning the regions in southern or upper, it's southern on the map, but it's upper because it's in the mountains, Egypt, which is where Memphis is, was the traditional capital before and after the Middle Kingdom, right? So the Middle Kingdom is the 12th, 13th, and 11th dynasties. They moved the capital to the northern region where the Israelites were during their story. Before and after, most of the time the capital was in southern Egypt, in Memphis, in the highlands of the mountains. So, because that had been such a traditional spot, that's where the other part of the military was. The other half of the military was down there, and then half of it was up north with the Pharaoh in his region. So when he died, and all the military died with him, they sent down a letter to Memphis. So he shows up with the military, and the Pharaoh who drowned in the Red Sea, his wife was Pharaoh then by default, and she mysteriously died when he showed up into town, and so he took over as Pharaoh, right? So, and that's the 13th dynasty, is when he took over as Pharaoh. So the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th dynasty were concurrent because it was a chaotic thing. Pharaoh had died. I want to say there was, in the next 200 years, there were 180 pharaohs in Egypt over the next 200 years. It was just total chaos. after the Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea.
So how many pharaohs between during the 12th time?
Amenemhat 1, Sostres 1, Amenemhat 2, Sostres 2, Amenemhat 3, Amenemhat 4, 6. And then the 7th one died in the plague. When Moses... No, in the plague.
In the plague.
So there were 6. The 6th one died in the Red Sea. His son, who would have been the 7th,
He
died in the plague when the firstborn was killed. Right? So Amenemhat 1 is the one prior to Joseph, who was almost killed by the butler.
What was the name of that book that you said that you in that class? Do you recall?
Exodus Mysteries, I think is the name of it.
Do you recall what the author of that is?
Ted Stewart, I think. So the 11. So you have Amenemhat 1 is prior to Joseph. Sostres 1 would be the one then that promoted Joseph. His son Amenemhat 2 then would have been part of Joseph's hoorah, during the good days. And then his son Sostres 2 would have kind of known Joseph towards the end. But then Joseph dies during his time. Then Sostres 3 takes over. Sostres 3 did not know Joseph, and Sostres 3 ordered his general to enslave all of these people. And so we have a letter from that general at his death saying that the thing that pleased Pharaoh most about his service was that he was able to capture all of the Asiatics and put them into slavery. And so that was Sostres 3. And then he's the one also that had all of the children thrown into the river, trying to kill them. Then Amenemhat 3 rises to power, being a child of Sostres 3. When all these babies were being thrown into the river, he was Sostres 3's son, which means he's about the same age as Moses. They grow up together. Then when Moses kills the Egyptian, Amenemhat 3 is, then fearful of Moses, probably, and wants to have Moses killed because Moses was very influential as well. So Moses flees during the 40-year reign. So that was right at the beginning when Amenemhat 3 rose to power. Amenemhat 3 was Pharaoh for exactly 40 years, which is exactly fits with the Bible story that Moses was in the wilderness for 40 years. Then Amenemhat 4 takes over, and he is the Pharaoh that Moses then interacts with and who eventually died in the Red Sea. So his son would have then succeeded him as the next Pharaoh, but he died in the plague. And then when Pharaoh died in the Red Sea, there's no one to take over except for the wife, and then she was quickly killed by the general as an easy target.
So this one, the one that was Pharaoh when Moses came back, so he probably didn't know Moses that well. Moses had known for
Right.
40 years.
Yeah, that's why the Bible said anyone that wanted your death is gone.
Yeah.
It's safe for you to return. So these people didn't really know Moses very well. And so that's the 12th dynasty. So I was looking up books about that, not because I think that they're going to say, oh, this is the pharaohs of the Exodus, but Egyptian archaeologists are the ones that have dug up the buildings from this time period. And so I'd like to see pictures of that time period because I know who these people were. Even if they don't, I'd like to see what they uncovered when they did the excavations of these people's towns, And so even though I could read through the book and not agree with any of their timeline or any of their interpretation, I still would like to see what they found because I know myself who these people were. And so it'd be kind of neat to see some things from these people. So as I was looking at it, the first book that I went to on Amazon, I always go down to read the reviews, see what people think. And so somebody had written a review yesterday that said, oh, this book reminds me of what's on display at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. That's why I was saying I want to go there. And so I thought, well, let me check that out. And so come to find out, from October through the end of January of this upcoming year, in New York, the museum in New York called the Metropolitan has all of the archaeological discoveries from the 12th dynasty on display. So they don't know what it is. They don't even know what they have. But all of it's on display. And so it's this big display. So we're hoping from that house sale that we're going to be able to take a 3-day trip to New York and see all of this stuff in person. So anyways, I want to show you guys on the computer here